looking through dump sites and towns and beaches to try to figure out how turtles died and what connection poaching has. And I commend these authors for highlighting that it's extremely difficult to get reliable data on illegal exploitation of protected species. And I also draw your attention to the very brief mentions it includes about culinary preferences and things like delicacies. So what do we really know about poaching within communities and between communities and throughout environmental histories and at various scales from local to global? For example, do we truly understand what happens when something like poaching or fishing is redesignated as illegal from one day to the next? And how do we deal with new cultures of poaching that are seen as a source of pride for participants? So I'd like us to turn to some of the literatures on poaching, and I've particularly chosen some examples of European case studies to sort of bring the problems home with the global conservation elite. So first I'd like us to reconsider our basic conceptualizations of poaching. We tend to paint ourselves, conservationists, as very different from poachers, but I would argue that we are both starting at points based on the fear of losses, current or future, and these are tied to legacies of past losses as well. So if you look at the category on the left, you see the perceived threats that poaching represents to conservation. And if you look at the potential losses on the right, you see the threats that having something called poaching represents to people or cultures involved. And so again, I'd like to build a bridge between, although you may not like this idea, conservationists and poachers, so that we sort of start thinking of ourselves as not that different after all. So one of the first suggestions in the literature on poaching is that context matters. So we have to be really careful about generalizing within communities and certainly between communities, countries, regions, and what have you. So for example, species are at risk, and we've proven that time and time again. But when we consider things like multiple socioeconomic factors, we can often not separate these from cultures, groups, and places. Thus, coming to point two, that poaching is complex and should not be homogenized. And that is because this is just a sampling of the types of motivations that can be involved in poaching initiation or participation. And I'd like to stress the importance of the last line on this slide that reminds us that poaching is not a story told once we figure it out. These categories are not mutually exclusive and can occur simultaneously and shift in individuals and in groups and societies. So I'd like to suggest to you that sometimes poaching is not just part of culture, but poaching is culture. So if you think about Bell et al.'s example from Lake Kirkini in Greece, what they did is provided a study of illegal hunting and fishing that was not only widely practiced, but widely discussed. And what they highlight in this case is in fact not a disassociation from nature, but a shared communal valuing of nature. And thus the society did not see this poaching as committing a crime against nature, how we might describe it, but rather as a valued interaction with nature. And there are socially sanctioned activities despite their illegality, and this was particularly important in terms of intergenerational knowledge transfer, identity formation, particularly with respect to male participants. The scary thing about this context to many of us in the room would be the fact that this poaching was occurring alongside passionate attachment to the species and the landscapes involved. And even within this one community, poaching was not uniform, even among poachers. And so there were discussions about what is real poaching versus what is poaching by the letter of the law. And not even poachers could agree on these. Proving that poaching can represent many things, from the material to the symbolic, something I think we're all getting much better at understanding. So for example, many scholars and practitioners and poachers have interpreted poaching as resistance. And this is a good reminder, it's with respect to an example in Sarawak, Malaysia, that poaching might not be seen as poaching in and of itself. It might be seen as an act of defiance of an extension of colonial rule, for example, or against conservation as development as seen in parallel with other unwanted or outsider forms of development like hydro development. So poaching can indeed persist despite conservation awareness, actions, and buy-in. And so despite the fact that we often hear arguments about greater needs for education and alternative livelihood provision, I want us to think seriously about what proof we have that this works in terms of the elimination of poaching, and what we think about the exceptions and whether or not they are in fact exceptions. In their case study of Saiga antelope poaching in 6 former USSR communities, Kuhl et al. Also present an interesting case. On the left-hand side, you see all the social barriers to poaching in the communities where they interviewed, surveyed, and interacted with poachers and non-poachers. So there were already a lot of social mechanisms in place to discourage poaching. And on the right-hand side, you see again that there was strong awareness of species, concern, willingness to take action, but poaching continued nonetheless. Therefore, I would like us to consider, as many of us have already, that poaching does not represent a lack of knowledge or education necessarily. And in fact, people can say one thing and do another. And so I would ask us whether or not our 100% goal is realistic in some cases. And I'll end with the case study of Tortuguero, somewhere where I have not been asking about poaching for a long time. And I believe this is one of the reasons I actually have seen, heard, and experienced various connections with poaching. And people do agree, in fact, I field tested this question last summer, that a turtle is worth more alive than dead, and yet poaching remains present and yet mysterious and not well understood. And I'll end with this case as an example because I would argue that within this one community, despite all of its successes and alternative options, there are various poaching cultures at work. There are different target products. There are those poaching to consume versus those poaching to exchange for cash. There's poaching to spite conservation and poaching in spite of conservation participation. And there is also poaching as resistance, such as a sort of a performative display of poached goods. So I'll end with this, and hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.